One of the things that I do in order to try to improve my D&D game is to take notes after each session. I make a Google Doc and I just whip out what I think went well for the session, what I could have worked on a bit more, things that I liked or didn't like, or what surprised me. Sometimes it's a couple of bullet points. Other times it's a 5-page essay on Google Docs. Literally a year ago, on February 26th, 2024, I am filming this on the 24th of February 2025, but almost a year ago exactly, I ran my very first D&D one-shot. I thought that this 5-page document that I wrote after my very first D&D session would be fun to go through and show the internet. That way, if there's anyone who is interested in becoming a DM, you can see that you don't have to be perfect and you're gonna learn a lot your first session, and maybe I can even save you some of the hassle of having to learn some of these things yourself. Hi, I'm Misty. This is Misty Steps. Kick off your shoes, grab a drink, get comfy, get a snack, and let's get into it. So part of why I am at my computer is so that I can reference these notes as we talk about them, because like I said, this is 5 pages of Google Doc, and you can kind of see it on the side of my screen scrolling as I do. Again, this was written February 26, 2024. I have not edited anything that I've written aside from maybe some grammatical stuff since then. It was, again, more of a reference for me so that afterwards I had something to write down and reflect on so that my next session could be even better. So this was the very first time I DM'd, which happened to be with friends who only knew D&D as the thing they saw on Big Bang Theory. All they knew about was that nerds played it, it involved dice, and funny voices. They're not wrong, but obviously there was a lot more to that and they were interested in learning. I think I learned more this first session than I have any other time. I was a newbie DM and frankly a newbie player as well. I was only a year into playing a character, if that, when I started DMing. And even though I still recommend playing with an experienced DM group to get more feedback from the DMs that are playing as your players, this was extremely helpful for a bunch of different reasons. But I think Past Me has some commentary on that coming up. So like I said, I was a newbie DM, and at the time, my players were brand new, hadn't seen anything aside from some memes, and I had more experience than they did, aside from my husband, who was also playing. He was the third. This was a couple that was playing, and I had my husband play as the third player, just to help balance the party a little bit more. But I had played a lot of Baldur's Gate. I had played in games before, so I was the veteran at the table. My husband had played a lot of 3.5, but had only recently started playing 5e shortly after I had started. One of the first things that I learned was character creation is a lot. If you don't know what you're looking at on that character sheet, it can be overwhelming. Because there were so many things to choose from for character creation, I actually limited my new players to just the player's handbook. This was to both narrow down their options so that they didn't have that decision fatigue, but also to keep it a little more straightforward and a little less confusing. I also started them at level 1, and we had a separate night for character creation. So we made characters one night, ordered pizza. The next session is when we actually did the one-shot. We met on Friday nights, so it was, a week or two difference. It took a good 4 hours of work, it says here, to go through all of the stuff that they needed to know to make a character. And then I took note of what spells they chose so I can make little spell cards that I know I've referenced in other videos that you guys have probably seen. You can also buy spell cards as well, but this was my very first time DMing, and I didn't know how it would go, so I didn't want to spend a ton of money. One of our new players did decide to be a druid, which is totally fine, but I did warn her it would be a little bit more complicated. But I made it as easy as possible as I could for her by giving her the stat blocks ahead of time. So at the one shot, I just had printed off the list of animals that she could turn into with their stat blocks. I didn't bother getting like cat or dog or non-combat related animals. I just told her that she could do those too. But anything that she might want to use in combat, I did offer her there. I also had them pick up their level 2 spells ahead of time so I could have those cheat cards ready to go, and I could just hand that to them when they did hit level 2. By the time they were done with character creation, they had everything figured out except for the bonds, traits, and flaws, which I really didn't go into. I've never really forced that on any game, even the RP heavy ones, because it's supposed to be just a general guideline for your character. Since these guys had never played before and had never roleplayed before, and that was a very foreign idea to them, I wanted to make sure that they had the option to just kind of be themselves if they weren't super comfortable with the roleplay aspect. I did promise funny voices, and I did deliver, but that was a choice that I made, and I think that that was the correct choice because I didn't want to overwhelm them with potential D&D shock. You know, I didn't want to get them in over their heads and think that this was way too intense for them. I wanted it to go at their pace because D&D kind of is that. It is at your pace. It's however you want it to go. I did let them leave with a copy of my player's handbook, an extra character sheet just in case, and a link to the 2014 5e.tools, which is one of my favorite websites for hunting things down, but again, Roll20, D&D Beyond, there's 100 different options there. The key thing is that I got them to the point where if they didn't want to look through or didn't have time to look through the player's handbook, they didn't have to. It was an option for them to review if they wanted to, but it was not necessary. My husband did wait, though, until he knew what the rest of the party was going to be before creating his character so that he could help fill in gaps as the other veteran at the table. I also had my husband behind the curtain with me. With this being my player's first ever game, I wanted them to have the potential to feel really cool, and I wanted them to see why people love D&D so much. My husband was originally thinking of playing a cleric, and when I told him that we were going to a haunted house with a bunch of skeletons, we decided against that, and he actually chose a bard instead, because as fun as the turn undead is for a cleric, that feature kind of fizzles out how cool it might be for a newbie player to be able to fight a swarm of skeletons. It may have felt a bit lackluster had he been able to just turn undead and the threat was gone. So I wanted him to pick a different class for that so that they could get the hang of combat and they could get their chance to be cool without a really high roll from a cleric, without some conveniently good wisdom saves, potentially ruining how cool that might be. I had told a lot of DM friends of mine that I wanted to run modules first, at least for my first few one-shots before doing a full homebrew campaign, because while I had a lot of ideas at the time, I wanted to be able to focus on the things that I knew I had a weakness in, like prepping combats, like keeping NPCs straight, that sort of thing, before diving straight into a homebrew where I was in charge of all of that. So I was going to use the very first Ghosts of Saltmarsh one-shot, where the players go to a haunted manor and they think that it's a haunting, but then it ends up being a smuggler situation. The original one-shot is built for 6 players, apparently, but I only had 3. And in the original one-shot, it's made for players level 1 to 2, which I kept, but I literally cut the adventure in half. So spoilers for Ghosts of Saltmarsh, which has been out for a very long time now, but it's just the first adventure. There is a haunted house that is haunted by a skeletal alchemist, and then you find out that the skeletal alchemist is a ruse and is actually just covering and keeping people away from the smugglers that are smuggling stuff out of the caves beneath the manor. Very Scooby-Doo energy, which is cool. But it was a very long adventure. I don't know how that would have ever been a single one-shot with how many combats were planned and the fact that it was balanced for 6 players. That was truly insane. So I cut it in half and I changed a lot of things. and it has now become my go-to newbie one-shot. I am making a video about that one-shot specifically, so go check that out if you haven't already. Stat blocks were the hardest part for me, for sure, but also the part that got improvised the most. I didn't change any base stats or attacks, but I did shrink how much damage things did, as again, this was the very first time they were playing, and I did want them to sweat and think, but I didn't want a swarm of spiders to knock them down. I didn't go into a ton of detail on that paragraph when I was writing it clearly, but I do know what I was talking about. Because they were level 1 and 2, they are very squishy. And because this campaign for Saltmarsh was, for some reason, 6 players balanced, things felt beefy. And there was a lot of potential combat. So I cut out a lot of that. There was some potential still for a snake, some giant weasels, some swarms of bugs, but I really narrowed it down, and as they found some combat, I removed other potential combats because I wanted it to be balanced. Again, I only had 3 players. They were level 1. They're very squishy. But also, this wasn't really where I wanted a challenge, mostly because as newbies, standard boring combat isn't boring. It's a lot to take in on what actions can I do, what's a bonus action, can I still move after I attack, what does opportunity attack mean, do I get advantage if I go up here? There's a lot of moving parts already, so that's why I shrunk down a lot of the combat. And I also pulled some punches. I also made some potion bottles and just a little newspaper as just some little props to help immerse them. It wasn't too much. It was just the front page of the newspaper for Saltmarsh Sentinel that I showed off in my props video, and the potion bottles as well. Just 4 potion bottles, or 3 potion bottles I gave them. I gave them 1 per person in case they needed it. But again, that's mostly because at level 1, it doesn't take much to knock you down. During the actual game, overall, I think it went really well. We offered to slice it into 2 sessions. So it was a Friday night, and we started around 5:30 or 6-ish, and around 9:30 or 10, they had only explored the first floor of the manor. They were very thorough in their investigations and their perceptions. So I said, you know, you've hit the top level. Do you want to stop here? Do you want to pause? We can do this a different night if you need to get to home. And they said they wanted to keep going. So we kept going. And we ended up ending around 2 a.m., but they did get through it all in one session. For context, I did just run this exact same one-shot here just last weekend, and it took 4 hours for the whole thing. So that's probably partially me being a better DM, but also different players are going to have different desires as to what they snoop through. I definitely learned a lot about combat balancing in that. It was a little bit of a throw into the wolves. I definitely had my stat blocks, but as I was rolling, I was learning, maybe I shouldn't have them add a +4 to this attack, or maybe I should have him hit a little harder, or, you know, that sort of thing. You kind of just learn on the fly. I didn't explain combat until we entered combat. I had mentioned briefly that there are, you know, attacks, spells, melee attacks, but I kept it very basic. No one had reactions aside from opportunity attacks, and I found one of the thousands of flowcharts online to help out with explaining the process of things. I also learned a lot about improvising. I changed where the combats were and what they were. The combats were 2 swarms of spiders at level 1 and then a big boss at level 2 that was scheduled. I actually ended up reskinning the spiders. I skinned one to be centipedes just to mix up the investigation pieces, just to switch it up, and to be able to pivot to say that I actually want this to be in this room because they are going there next and we're kind of getting into a lull and I want to give them that other combat. That was a very good lesson in improv. House rules, I didn't have a ton at my very first D&D session that I DM'd, but max damage crits and Rule of Cool were definitely ones that I had brought in. I said that I was pro shenanigan and that if you wanted to try something, that even if it's not in the book, let me know and let's see what we can make happen. And I do really think that that was an ideal option. So at the time, the question was, can my druid wile a giant spider, Spider-Man sling, and entangle a person? We talked about what that would look like, and we decided to let it happen. The ruling was that it didn't do damage, it can only target one person at a time, and they had to make a strength saving throw to get free, kind of like a long-range grapple. So I think that that was fair. I also improv'd a lot of treasures. Like I said, this game in particular, they were very big on that investigation and perception. They wanted to look under every piece of furniture and every bookcase and every drawer. And because this was a manor, there was a lot of rooms that were empty. With this being their very first time playing, I didn't want this to be dull and boring and just having empty room after empty room. So I did add treasure on the fly. It wasn't always useful. Like, none of them were going to be able to use a necromancer spell book, but they could sell it for more gold, and it felt cool finding a necromancer spell book. They also found a lot of expensive gems, and those gems and their price range would absolutely be coming back to bite me in the ass later. Foreshadowing, guys. See, after defeating the boss, after defeating the skeletal alchemist, and lifting the proverbial curse, the haunting is done, they actually managed to succeed in persuading the mayor to give them the house free of charge. The agreement was like, yeah, they can have the house, we'll sign the paperwork, but they have to pay for renovations. Well, I gave them an awful lot of money in all of those treasures that they found. So, I then had to, because they wanted this to continue into campaign, which, ideal, honestly, that I think is the best goal that you can have when playing for newbies that have never played, is that they have enough fun that they want to continue the game, and they want to continue the story. I had to come up with what it looks like for them to reno this giant manor. They did end the first session. They would be level 3 if we are continuing, but they're just level 1 and 2 during the game. Post-game, again, everyone had a good time. There were some fails. Some people got a nat 20, and that's always fun to see the very first nat 20 someone gets and be able to animate that and express how cool that is to them. Pat did say he knew that I threw my rolls. He knew that I pulled my punches, but I don't necessarily regret doing it. Remember, I had a very strong 4 or 5 nat 20s in a row rolling skeletons. I was not going to hit level 2 players with that many nat 20s when we do max crits. I simply was not. It was not going to be fun for anyone if we did that. I didn't want to get into explaining death saves. I wanted them to win and have a fun time. If these had been more experienced players, I absolutely wouldn't have. I would have just let it keep happening, but that's a lot of crits for people who don't know what they're doing. It was a haunted house, not the death house in Strahd. Aside from this being my personal first time as a DM, we were also testing out a game table that we had made, and that game table is the same one that is currently in our game room that I will show whenever I get around to making a tour. But it was still very rough. It still needed to be sanded, but it worked well for the rolls. It worked well for minis and maps, and it worked great for all intents and purposes at that start. It has definitely evolved since then, and I'm very excited to see what can be done next. If people are interested in how we made a game table, let me know, and I will bully my husband Pat into making a video for that here, because I'll be honest, he did all of the work. I just provided some fabric and paint and design opinions. The number one takeaway written here is that DMing wasn't as terrifying as I thought it maybe would be. I was definitely still nervous, but I do think in hindsight, running a game for newbies who didn't have any expectations of this game was a great way to introduce myself to DMing, because it allowed me to get a little bit more confidence before facing my DM friends. My veteran friends have been playing this for years and years and years, and I'm still very new to the hobby. So for them to have baby newbie show up and not have any idea what she was doing, little bit scarier to think about me doing that. But I'm glad that I had the opportunity to play for someone who didn't have any expectations, so any sort of fun time was gonna be a fun time. Hi. Dog is under my table. I also learned that I wanted to get better at maintaining my NPC character voices, which is just practice, usually in the shower if you're me. I do want to run some different one-shots so I can get some more experienced advice and critique, but at the time I did have some Candlekeep ones picked out, which also was a very fun time. Shortly after I DM'd for this group, I saw Jenny D's character journal video, and I took a lot of inspiration from that and started making a DM's journal. So any one shot that I ran, I would snip and paste into this journal so that as long as I had that journal and some dice, I would have a whole adventure ready to go without me having to re-prep things. So in that journal, I have stat blocks, maps that I can just blow up onto larger dry erase and draw out, loot lists, stat blocks, vibes, pictures of the haunted house itself, anything like that I started adding in there, as well as just any key information from the book that I wanted to make sure that I emphasized every time I ran this. And that's been very helpful in running it additional times, is just having that information at the ready. I don't have to do any prep really. I just have to find Spooky Haunted House playlist on Spotify, grab some minis, draw out the map. Like, that's very minimal prep on my end now that I've run it once. Aside from this giving me the confidence, I do think it was probably easier for me to start with newbies that didn't have any expectation, because they knew nothing. They didn't know if it was normal or not for me to be like, oh wait, shoot, let me look up that rule. Or to roll with being able to spidey sling as a giant spider. Okay, that's the end of everything I wrote. Now that it's been a year since I made these notes though, I do want to offer some additional suggestions. I definitely want to emphasize that I think one-shots are the best way to start as a DM. I think that it is much easier to prep for than a whole campaign, and it also gives you the opportunity to know that if you're really floundering around, it's just one session, so if you decide it is not for you, then that's fine. I also suggest making sure that you do DM for your experienced veteran friends so that they can provide feedback for you. But with these newbies, I didn't have to worry about comparing myself to my DM friends who have run some phenomenal games that I am truly in awe of. Like, I could only hope that I could run a game as well as my DM for Strahd does. But this was just me and a group of our friends having fun. There was no expectations, it was very low stakes all the way around, and that was something that was truly inviting and truly raised my confidence. If you're having fun, that's the goal no matter what in D&D. But I do think that this helped with me feeling more comfortable in the DM seat, in that driver's seat, and I think that it did definitely help me become the more skilled DM that I am today. If you've stuck around for this whole video, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate it very much. Feel free to like, subscribe, all that stuff YouTube says, and I will see you next time.